Welcome to CACF's webinar on supporting API English language learners. We are really excited to reveal findings, to talk about the importance of supporting all students in our school system, to hear from experts like youth, our community-based organizations, and our partners in this work to better serve our API youth in schools. To get us started, I wanted to do an introduction of who is going to be facilitating today. I'm going to first pass it to Kulsum.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Kulsum Tapal. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Education Policy Coordinator, and I'll be speaking in a bit, but I'll pass it to Aqida to introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Aqida Rama. I'm a former ASAP youth leader in the Language Access Campaign. I'm also a former education policy intern at CACF and the author of the case study. I'm a sophomore studying chemistry, and my pronouns are she, her. I'll pass it to Felicia.
Thank you. And I'm Felicia Singh, Director of Policy and Government Relations here at CACF. Just a little bit about CACF. Next slide, please, so that for those of you who are joining us that might not know about our organization, but we were founded in 1986, and we are the nation's only Pan-Asian children and families advocacy organization. We do our policy advocacy in a couple of ways. We bring together community-based organizations, as well as youth and our government stakeholders to advocate for equity for API New Yorkers. And one of the areas in which we cover our advocacy is through education. We believe that education is quite an important tool to facilitate systems change. And one of the systems that do need to get better, especially in a time in which admits federal changes and federal impact to New York, is how we support English language learners. That is why this panel that you're going to hear about in a little bit, but also the conversation of supporting Asian American Pacific Islander English language learners is so critical. I'm going to pass it to Kulsum, who's going to go into a little bit of a deeper dive into our education equity agenda.
Yeah, thank you so much, Felicia. And as Felicia shared, we'll definitely have our amazing panel in a bit, but before we go into that, we wanted to share a little bit of context on our current moment to help inform the conversation that is to come. So at CACF, we believe that every child deserves a safe, inclusive, and fully resourced education. And our priorities include inclusive admissions and enrollments practices so all students can access those quality schools, data disaggregation so we can better understand the diverse needs of AAPI students, and advancing culturally responsive teaching and learning so our students can feel truly seen and heard in the classroom. We're also pushing for equity for API English language learners, which we'll hear more about today, who are not a monolith, right? We speak more than 50 languages just here in New York City, and for API students with disabilities who are often underdiagnosed and underserved. Beyond the classroom, our agenda emphasizes family engagement through language accessible communication and strong partnership with community-based organizations, many of whom are on call today. And we also call for improved mental health and well-being supports, which are especially critical in the face of ongoing anti-Asian violence. At the heart of this agenda and of our organization, there's this simple truth, which schools are a public good and they must be fully funded, safe, and a conduit for resources so that every student can have the things they need to thrive in and beyond the classroom. So with that, let's ask ourselves kind of a basic grounding question, right? Who is considered an L, and what are the rights that an L student has here in New York? So according to New York State, an English language learner is a student who speaks or understands a language other than English and speaks or understands little to no English and requires some support to become proficient. So to set up some context to that definition, we're going to take it back to some history. So in the early 1970s, about 1,800 Chinese-speaking students in San Francisco public schools did not receive the supplemental education instruction, English instruction they needed. Only about 1,000 of them were offered any support, like English as a second language class, for example. The rest were placed in regular classrooms with no additional support or help. And this left students and families feeling like they had been denied an equal opportunity to education. This resulted in a monumental ruling in this court case, Lau versus Nichols, which said that English language learner students have the right to a meaningful opportunity to participate in the educational program. So this ruling has set the groundwork for monumental policy and court cases since then, not just for AAPI English language learners, but for all English language learners. And in New York State, in 1974, we soon adopted the Spira consent decree in line with that Supreme Court calling or ruling to ensure that ELLs have the same opportunities to meet established standards, which includes access to bilingual education and all required programs necessary for graduation. So some further context in the current moment that we're in, which is that this court case established a key precedent for how ELLs deserve resources to thrive in the classroom. And in 2015, there was a Dear Colleague letter federally issued that detailed out what that looks like. Just last month, the current federal administration actually revoked that letter, which has been used across the country, including in New York State, to write out policy and regulation, which helps us enforce this court ruling. So that's kind of our current status at the moment. So I want to get back to the crux of what we're talking about today, which is AAPI English language learners. And to understand AAPI English language learners is to first understand that there's a lot of us. There are 17% of English language learners are enrolled in New York City public schools, and that is about 25,000 students just here in New York City. And these students belong to more than 30 ethnic groups and over 50 languages. And some of the highly spoken languages include various forms of Chinese, Bengali, Korean, Tagalog, but there are so many other languages that are not on this list but are spoken. And so it's important to note that last year, NYC DOE data, Department of Education data, showed that New York City public students, school students, spoke over 156 languages, right? And among the top 10 languages spoken at home, 5 came from AAPI communities. And this includes Chinese, Arabic, Bengali, Urdu, and Uzbek. Currently, the city only requires schools to translate official materials into 12 languages, which means that more than 10,000 students speaking languages outside this list that you can see on your screen, many of which come from AAPI communities, are not, these families and these students are not receiving critical information necessary to fully participate in their education. So now you've heard a little bit of the context setting, and I'm going to pass it over to Aqida to share a little bit about the ASAP Language Access Campaign as part of CACF, as well as her learnings in being a part of that campaign. So I'll pass it over to Aqida.
Specifically in ASAP, I worked directly on the Language Access Campaign, and a part of this campaign, we focused on advocating for more culturally responsive spaces in New York City high schools, especially for AAPI ELL students like myself or those I've worked with. And the campaign centers on the idea that language access is more than just translation. It's about building school environments where students feel understood, supported, and seen, both academically and socially. And in the campaign, we were able to get testimonies from other API ELL students as well as research on issues that are going on. And we identified several systemic issues that prevented AAPI ELL students from thriving. When we spoke to AAPI ELL students, we learned that language and academic barriers often left them behind. They mentioned struggling with fast-paced lessons, vocabulary they hadn't encountered before, and missing class content when pulled out for ELL support. Some support programs also didn't match their actual needs. Beyond academics, social isolation was a big issue. Many students found it hard to make friends because of cultural differences, saying that they didn't understand slang or feeling judged for their accents or quietness. Emotionally, students reported feeling nervous, afraid of making mistakes, and ignored by teachers when facing bullying or racism. There were also a lot of pressures, like to catch up, transition into mainstream classes, and succeed without enough support. Finally, students lacked opportunities to practice English in safe environments, especially when their home languages were discouraged or when schools didn't provide dedicated ELL programs at all.
Thank you for that context, and we'll hear back from Aqida soon on the case study. But to further contextualize, I want to share some required supports for ELL students. That is that in New York State, all school districts are required to provide English language learners with either a bilingual education program or English as a new language program. ELL students are also entitled to receive the required instructional time or units of study, which vary based on their English proficiency and grade level. And to support this instruction, there are also state required outlines on what teacher qualifications and mandates for professional development look like. While there are rooms for improvement in even these systems, it's important to note that a lot of these systems do exist and to understand how they are currently being implemented. Which brings us to the Comptroller's report, which was recently released, and we want to share some key findings that came out of the report. So according to the report, DOE failed to provide ELL students with required services. And these required services are documented in some of the sources listed on the slide that you're welcome to look at later, and I'm happy to share more on that later as well via email. But some of the key findings include that 48% of sampled English language learner students did not provide for 48% of sampled English language learners, DOE did not provide required courses or minimum number of minutes required for bilingual education time. DOE also filed over 146 waivers to avoid creating mandated bilingual education programs. And as we can see here, this denied access for significant populations within the AAPI community, which includes Bengali-speaking, Arabic-speaking, and Uzbek-speaking communities. Additionally, the findings found that 40% of sampled ELL students were taught by one or more educator without the required certification, which also highlights a key gap in professional development and certification required. And this trickled into, of course, a critical 31% of sampled students provided no evidence that DOE informed their parents of their rights or the preferred language, which hinders the process in which educators, families, and schools can work together to properly support a student that is an English language learner. Some suggested areas of improvement include that there must be a corrected use of waivers and an expansion of bilingual programs. It's important to note that in high demand AAPI districts, such as South Brooklyn and Queens, this was particularly of concern, right? 49% of NYC, New York City's Asian population is based in Queens, and another 29% is based in Brooklyn. Additionally, as mentioned earlier, teacher recruitment and certification is certainly something that needs to be improved so that we can urgently recruit and certify educators in these high-need languages, as well as the other languages, as mentioned earlier, that are not receiving any sort of attention at all right now. So with that context, I want to bring it back to Aqida to share a little bit on the case study that she wrote and developed, as well as some key recommendations and findings that came out of that report. So passing it back to Aqida.
Thank you. For my case study, I focused on addressing the needs of AAPI English language learners in New York schools. And my goal was to explore the experiences of AAPI ELL students, not just through statistics, but by listening to real voices and stories. I combined research, interviews, and my own experience to paint a fuller picture. And this case study had three main goals. First, to document the barriers that prevent ELL students from getting an equitable education. Things like lack of bilingual staff, cultural unresponsive teaching, and language barriers that isolate families. Second, we wanted to share real stories of API students in middle and high school. And these case studies showed how academic challenges are tied to emotional and social isolation. For example, a student was placed in a wrong level class and fell behind, not because of ability, but because of the system that didn't see his needs. Third, we wanted to include actionable recommendations from how teachers can change their classroom practices to how city level policy needs to shift. And these goals are about making sure that every student, regardless of background or language, has a fair opportunity to thrive. Moving on to key findings. Through interviews, research, and personal experience, here's what we found. First, academic gaps continue when teaching doesn't meet students where they are. Many students lack bilingual staff, inclusive mental health services, and diverse learning materials. Parents are often excluded from the education process due to lack of language support, and students experience high levels of emotional stress, isolation, and external responsibilities like caregiving or housing instability, all of which affect their school success. And this isn't just a student issue, it's a system issue that requires broad change. And for recommendations, before I start, the full recommendations are in the case study linked, that should be linked in the comments. So to begin, for elected officials, the focus is on funding ELL programs, expanding language access, and flexible graduation pathways. Schools should expand bilingual support like mental health services, tutoring, and after-school programs, and adopt culturally responsive curriculum. And policy and school level changes set the foundation for student success. For educators and community partners, educators should engage in ongoing training in ELL instruction and culturally responsive teaching, and share strategies through peer networks. Community partners can provide tutoring and mentorship, family workshops, and inclusive extracurriculars. And schools and communities need to work together in order to support students. And families and students benefit from accessible, culturally responsive workshops, mentorship programs, and extracurriculars that build confidence and community. When families are engaged, the whole system becomes stronger. And again, this is just a summary. The full recommendations are in the case study in the comments, and I encourage everyone to download and read it for all the details. And I'll pass it back to Kulsum.
Yay, thank you. Yeah, we're so excited to share the official case study, and I just want to reiterate a huge shout out to Aqida, who put in so much hard work, research, spoke to some folks who are on this call today, right? Spoke to peers and students and did a lot of research to put real life experiences as best as possible to document some of these stories in ways that we can utilize as community leaders, as advocates, to help hopefully improve the system in the best ways possible. So shout out again to Akita, who we'll also hear from in our panel, which is actually an excellent transition to our panel. So I'm really excited to introduce our panelists, who I will read their bios and then we will go into questions. And we'll share at the start of each question who the question is addressed to. So thank you again to our panelists for coming and being a part of this really important conversation. So to start off, I'm really excited to introduce Chair Rita Joseph, who is a New York City Council member and is a strong advocate for our public schools and students. Her advocacy is largely shaped by her experience as a public school teacher, community advocate, and a proud union member. Thank you so much, Chair Joseph, for joining us today and sharing your thoughts. Additionally, I'm just going to read the introductions at once so we can get into the questions, but we'll also give an opportunity for folks to add into their intros when they begin to respond to the first question. Also really excited to introduce Teresa Baik, who's the Director of Education at the Korean Community Services of Metropolitan New York, KCS, which is a nonprofit social service agency serving communities across New York and New Jersey. And in her role, she oversees a range of youth and adult programs, including a children's summer camp, ESOL classes for adults, and a high school and some college internship program. Her guiding vision is to make education accessible for all. And KCS is also an amazing community member and coalition member of CACF. We're also really happy to welcome Dr. Sabrin Abedin, who is a Bangladeshi American Muslim, mother of three, and a passionate educator dedicated to creating inclusive and joyful spaces where all children can thrive. With experiences as a teacher, administrator, and now currently the Bronx ELL director, she brings both professional expertise and personal insight as a former ELL for over 330 schools in the Bronx. As a lifelong advocate for children and families, Dr. Abedin believes deeply in the power of education, family, and community to uplift every child. And lastly, but not least, also welcoming back Aqida into our panel conversation, who was able to introduce herself earlier today. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And I'm going to stop sharing screen so we can see our panelists. Hello.
And as you're all speaking, I'm just going to start pinning you all so that folks can see you as a panel. So we can get started, and then I'll just have everyone pinned by then.
Excellent. Thank you so much. All right, so we're going to jump into it. So our first question is for everybody on the panel. What specific challenges do ELL, MLL students face in navigating New York City school admissions and enrollment? And perhaps I can cue us, since all folks are asked to respond, and then of course we can kind of pass the mic as things come to our minds. But maybe Chair Joseph, if you want to start with answering this question.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. What specific challenges? Ooh, there's so many I can start listing. As a forever educator and also representing this district with large immigrant communities, I know that, for example, the admission process has been a struggle for parents. I know they released it today in so many different languages, but one of the things I've always said, and I saw firsthand, is sometimes parents speak more than one language, but they don't read them. So we also have that bi-illiterate situation that we have as well, where parents don't read it. Enrollment process is often designed with not ENL students. Our multi-language learner students are not thought of. Language has always been a barrier in filling out the applications. Communications are often available in languages that are not spoken at home. So a lot of those things, so that's why tomorrow's hearing is going to be so important. We get to see what is in place for our families. Many parents are also not familiar with the structure of New York City public schools because it's such a large system. Folks don't know how to navigate it, especially English is not the first language in navigating. You see institutions, you see government as a barrier, intimidation, and depending on the culture, government is not something normally we would go to. We would rely solely on teachers. I remember there was a parent I used to call. Every time I call her, she's like, Miss Joseph, just take her to the bathroom and do what you got to do, And I used to be like, no, I'm going to lose my license. I cannot do that. But it was part of the culture. So I would have to teach her to say, no, I cannot take her to the bathroom. No, I cannot do anything I want. There's rules and places and there's rules in place to make sure students are protected. Also, we also see issues in placement delays for our ENL students, especially if they need push in, pull out, if they need bilingual programming. Sometimes it takes a long time to find the right program in the right setting for our students. And normally also our students who are also multi-language learners who also have an IEP. We saw a lot of struggles to get bilingual school psychologists to do evaluations, social workers, guidance counselors. So there is so many academically, sometimes they're not meeting the social needs of our students as well. So tomorrow's hearing is gonna show a lot, and I'm always the type of chair that to bring problem and solutions. How do we create solutions to make sure our students are moving in the way we want? And we always want to remind students, and I've been saying this for a long time, that the culture, the music, the food, those are not a deficit, those are superpowers. And I want to remind every young person around this city who speaks another language, who shares another culture, that that's a superpower.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful response. I will pass it to Teresa if you're okay to take it on next.
Yeah, absolutely. Once again, thank you so much for inviting me. And Aqida, I was reading your report because I got it early over the weekends as I was prepping for it, and I was amazed just to see the findings. And thank you so much for honestly taking the time out of your busy schedule as a student, as a former student, to create this. I think it's so necessary. Yeah, there's just so many challenges. I think the biggest thing is ELL students feel isolated in the process, once again, because their parents are not familiar with the process and they themselves are not familiar. it's kind of awkward for them to ask other friends as well. And they, once I think Chair Joseph just mentioned it beautifully about a lot of the cultural barriers as well. Like if you specifically come from Asian countries, East Asian countries, then education is sort of like a rivalry, right? And so you don't want to share that important information with like your other peers because you think that, they might take that one step ahead of you. And so I think isolation is a big thing. Translation, just miscommunication, and they might be hearing one thing from a student or from a fellow parent or a student leader or a school teacher, but it might not be the correct information. And so I just think there needs to be more spaces where parents and kids are involved and it's shared in their language that they speak at home. And so I just hope that this opens up a greater conversation. And I know that this doesn't really focus on school admission and enrollment, but a lot of students, specifically when it comes to parent-teacher conference, a lot of parents are afraid to go in because obviously they don't speak English, but they are curious about where their student is in their child's education process. And so I think having a bilingual translator so that they're able to be more involved would just also be a great asset as well.
Thank you so much. Dr. Abedin.
Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be in community with all of you. So to answer this question, Chair Joseph and Teresa, thank you so much for, answering some of the things that I was also going to say, which shows that these have been some of the persistent challenges, right, for our multilingual learners and their families, across the city. But really, I would say one of the challenges that we have is the complexity of the admissions and enrollment process itself. So even with the ongoing efforts to translate materials, there are still gaps in access to clear, linguistically appropriate, and culturally affirming information, especially for families speaking low incidence languages that you've mentioned, Kulsum. So as the title of this event suggests, right, we need support that goes beyond translation. For example, I personally speak Bangla, but I cannot read or write it. On the other hand, I can read and write Arabic, but I don't speak it. So if I were navigating the admissions process as a parent for my child and were only given written resources in Bangla, it would likely add to the confusion rather than help me, right? And I think that's what Chair Joseph was getting to as well. But this also underscores why translated materials, while important, are simply not enough, right? We do need multilingual staff who reflects the language backgrounds and lived experiences of the communities that we serve. And too often, families are left to navigate an already complex system without anyone on site who can communicate with them in their preferred language. And so this shortage of culturally responsive staff can often make an intimidating process feel even more isolating. With that being said, I do want to add that, it's easier said than done to always have multilingual staff available, but also office staff must be trained on how to engage in a respectful way and really speak to them effectively with families who speak other languages, right? Connection doesn't solely we shouldn't rely solely on words, but more so body language too, right? A warm tone and a simple smile can really go a long way for our families. And then, of course, unfortunately, there are times when no words are exchanged, but a family leaves feeling frustrated or unwelcome, not because of language barrier, but because of a lack of empathy and cultural awareness, right? And so I think really the first interaction that our families have with schools can really set the tone for their entire experience. And that moment must be welcoming, affirming, and inclusive, regardless of the language spoken. So with that being said, just to summarize, we must ensure that our families feel accommodated through intentional outreach in language communication and ensure that we have staff who are equipped both linguistically and culturally to support them.
Thank you so much. And I will pass it to Aqida.
I agree with what everyone said on the panel so far, and as a student who has gone through the admissions process as an ELL learner with parents who did not fully understand English, a lot of these struggles are still persistent. And a lot of schools do offer in-person open houses and orientations to help explain the process and walk parents through the process. However, these meetings are usually in English, and parents may not understand the deadlines or requirements because materials and the words aren't translated, and schools don't always have staff who can walk them through the process in their language. So it was me coming to these meetings along with my parents and like live translating for them. And it would be hard because I didn't understand fully what was going on myself and I didn't know who to ask. And a lot of that, and on top of that, some students end up being placed in the wrong classes or schools without strong ELL programs, not because of their ability, but because of the system that didn't account for their needs. And all of this makes it harder for ELL students to start school on an equal footing.
Thank you so much, everyone, for such thoughtful responses. And it definitely sounds like everyone is on the same page and working really hard to address already these challenges. But it's illuminating to also understand what challenges do show up when parents and students are approaching admissions and enrollment. The next question, also for everybody, and we can maybe go through the same order we went through last time, is what role does family engagement play in supporting ELL, MLL students, and how can schools overcome language and cultural barriers to enhance that? I know some folks already touched on this answer, but if there's anything folks want to add in expanding to this, this is a great place to do so. Thanks, and I will pass it back to Chair Joseph to kick us off.
Yes, thank you. I've always centered family engagement. If you engage parents, you empower them to feel part of a system. Yes, they have to also think about language. I don't think anyone, when they were building out the system, was thinking of multi-language families. And as you mentioned before, sometimes it's the students that were the only English-speaking person in their home. And they are the interpreter and the translator. They are the ones reading the bills. They are the ones doing everything. So I knew I grew up in a household like that where my grandparents only spoke Haitian Creole. They didn't speak English. So we were also they also try to make sure that I was placed in a bilingual school so they can interact with the teachers. But now some of these programs have gone away at the rate that they were here. That was another thing that I don't know if anybody has followed the trend. They had closed out a lot of bilingual programs. They're now making a comeback. But for a long time, bilingual program, they was like, oh, we don't need them anymore. We're just going to do push in and pull out. But those bilingual programs were so important for families too, because they can connect to someone who spoke English, who spoke their language and shared the culture. I remember at one point I went to PS 189, which remains the only bilingual school now in Brooklyn, where they celebrated the Haitian culture. That's where I learned about the Haitian culture, the music, the food, the dance. And my grandmother, her pride and joy was to cook for that event. If there was not that connection, she would have probably stayed away. So we have to remember to come back to community. And when we center policies as a policymaker, and because I've experienced that, I always keep that in mind, making sure that language access is available, and not only through reading and writing, as you mentioned earlier, Dr. Sabrin, that sometimes they don't read and write the language. They also got to hear it. Auditory, are we doing enough robocalls? Are we, and even sometimes texting doesn't help, because if I don't read the language, I have no idea what you're sending to me. So family engagement, and also creating parent ambassadors. I remember during COVID, they had such a parent university for parents to get involved in the school, no matter what language you spoke, and have peer parents. I know one school in my district, the parents pair up together. So one who speaks the language and one who doesn't, they pair up each other and they help each other navigate it, because there was no one who spoke that particular language. And I remember Councilmember Gutierrez mentioning she has a huge community of Quechua in her district. That's a low incidence language. There's nothing out there for them. So this is where we use the community to make sure the messaging is getting out in their own language. So, and I've just inherited, because of redistricting, a huge Uzbek community in my district. And I was very happy to see Uzbek as one of the languages that was added on, along with Albania. And there was one other language that slipped my mind that they added on. Those will allow parents to come in if they hear it. Auditory ads should be in multi-language. Ethnic media should be part of that to engage parents, to bring them into the system. So there's so many different ways we can engage parents, because I think, and I've always said this on the record, education should not be just about the child. It should include the parent on this educational journey.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I think I see it in the chat, but just highlighting this, your remarks emphasize the importance of data disaggregation, of really understanding within the AAPI community what languages are being spoken, right? What cultures are in certain communities, so we can really cater those services. So thank you for that. And I'll pass it to Teresa.
Yeah, I think before I answer this question, something that Dr. Abedin said was about translation. And although we're really grateful that they're translators, sometimes the documents are not well translated. And as a result, there's a lot of miscommunication in that as well. And so it would be great. And I think I've talked to New York City FACE, the Family and Community Engagement, and not only just me, but other community members and organizations have talked about translation and how that also can be a miscommunication for the parents and also for the children as well. I think in terms of family engagement, it's extremely crucial. But we also need to keep in mind that immigrant parents are working really long hours. And so it's also, how do we involve them while understanding that they're also living very busy lives. And as a result, the child is alone in all of this process. And what can the school be doing, whether it's more offering like school counseling, whether there's a translator, where there is a translator involved in the process. And so there's a school counselor, a translator, and the student, and they're able to meet, whether it's weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly, just to check in and see, like, are there any resources that they need assistance with? And so it's working through all of that, and also understanding that because for the parents, especially because it's new for them, and they're also overwhelmed with adjusting to New York City life and the immigrant life too, that I think just being respectful of all of that. Yeah.
Teresa, thank you so much. I don't know if you saw me snap my fingers. I totally agree. Family engagement is foundational to the success of our ELL students. But true engagement goes beyond inviting families to events, right? Like you've mentioned, Teresa, they live busy lives. And I think it's truly about making them part of the day-to-day life of the school. So whether it's inviting them into classrooms to share their stories, or creating spaces where they can showcase their strengths and/or cultures, families are partners in this work, right? And so it's about really shifting mindsets from just informing our families to partnering with them. And that mindset makes all the difference. And so going back to what you've mentioned with scheduling and scheduling constraints, our multilingual learner or families bring incredible cultural wealth, right? And a desire to support their children's educational journey. And so we need to create welcoming environments where all families, regardless of language proficiency or immigration status, feel seen, heard, and respected. For example, in one elementary school in the Bronx, families were invited to sign up and share a holiday or cultural tradition with their child's class during the month it was celebrated. I know oftentimes we have all these holidays and we're like, wait a minute, who celebrates this? What is this about, right? So it ensures everyone to feel included. And participation could take place either in person or virtually. So there's, giving parents that option to kind of share how they want due to their schedules. And it also allows for an inclusive and flexible opportunity for all families to engage regardless, right? As we've mentioned, of language or scheduling constraints. At another school in the Bronx, what I've seen were that school students were encouraged to bring in 5 personal items that reflected their identities, cultures, and traditions, and they would present on a monthly basis. So families were actively involved in selecting and sharing these items, fostering a deeper connection between home and school, while creating opportunities for cultural exchange and mutual learning within the classroom. And so, with that being said, I did want to put this out there that we often assume that family engagement must happen through evening or after school events, but meaningful connection can take many forms. Even without speaking the same language, we can communicate through body language, a warm tone, and a simple smile. And the language of play and human connection often speak louder than words. I always say lack of communication does not mean lack of thought. So these small yet powerful gestures help create a school environment that is welcoming, affirming, and inclusive for all families, regardless of linguistic or cultural background.
Thank you so much for sharing, and I'll pass it to Aqida.
I also think that family engagement plays a huge role in supporting ELL and MLL students, not just academically, but emotionally as well. Like everyone has said, when families feel welcomed, informed, and understood by the school, students feel more confident and more supported and more connected to their learning environment. And that kind of engagement doesn't happen on its own. Schools need to actively create the space for it. And that means offering translation and interpretation services, sending home communications in family home languages, hosting culturally inclusive events, and most importantly, building trust over time through genuine connections and interactions. And it's also important for schools to realize that family involvement doesn't look the same in every culture, like the panelists have said before. Not all parents are going to attend PTA meetings or email teachers, but it doesn't mean that they don't care. Some families show their support in other ways, by working long hours, by prioritizing education at home, or by quietly encouraging their children behind the scenes. Speaking from my own experience, I'm the child of immigrants and my parents didn't speak English fluently. They deeply cared about my education, but they were intimidated by the school system. They didn't always know what was going on, and didn't feel like there was a place for them to be involved. And there weren't always interpreters at parent-teacher conferences or materials sent home regularly in our home language, which is Bangla. And looking back, I wish my school had done more to meet them halfway. And if there had been some language accessible meetings or even just a staff member who could speak with them in their language and walk them through any of their confusions, I feel like they would have been a lot more confident and included. And for me, I feel like it would have made a big difference. As a student, you want them to feel like they're a team, and I didn't always feel that growing up. And I know many ELL students currently still don't. And that's why I think language access and culturally responsive engagement aren't just like extra things that need to be added. I think there should be a part of like the essential needs of the school system.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing from experience and for everyone for thoughtfully answering this. So the next question is also for everyone, but we can maybe shift up the order and go the other way. And so, if Aqida, if you want to take this one first, this is what system changes or policy reforms are needed to ensure equitable access to high quality education for ELL, MLL students across New York City?
To make education fully equitable for ELL and ML students in New York City, we need more than just quick fixes. We need systemic change, and that starts with hiring more bilingual teachers, counselors, and staff so that students and families have real support in their own languages. Schools also need stronger language access policies that guarantee translation and interpretation for every major communication with families. On the classroom side, I think we need more culturally responsive curriculum that reflects students' identities and languages so that they feel seen in their education. And every school should have consistent, high quality ELL programs instead of pulling students out randomly or leaving them without services altogether. And we can't forget mental health. Students need access to counselors who understand their cultural context and can provide support in their languages. And on a policy level, admissions and enrollment have to be more transparent and accessible, and schools should be held accountable if they're not. And they should be held accountable if they're not meeting the needs of their ELL populations. I'll pass it
Thank
on.
you. Yeah, thank you so much. And we'll pass it to Dr. Abedin.
Aqida, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to try to keep it to novel ideas only, but I do agree with everything that the panelists are saying. I have a lot to say about this this question, but really to ensure equitable access for our ELLs. Again, easier said than done, but we must look at both structural reform and resource allocation, and begin by ensuring that programming decisions are truly driven by community need and not limited by staffing constraints. When there's a clear demand for a bilingual program, let's say, we should be mobilizing the strengths and resources within that community to bring it to life. The absence of readily available resources or certified staff should not be a reason to delay or deny access. Instead, policies must be revisited and refined to support the development of programs in alignment with community needs while ensuring that our schools can truly move forward without fear of non-compliance, being non-compliant with mandates. Meeting the needs of our multilingual learners requires both flexibility and a commitment to equity. Another critical reform that I will mention is how we define and measure success for our ELLs. And current accountability systems often fail to capture the unique growth trajectories of our multilingual learner students. Another challenge is the disconnect between language proficiency assessments like the NYSSLAT and what our educators actually know about this assessment. Our students take the NYSSLAT to demonstrate their progress in language proficiency and growth, yet unfortunately, very few teachers fully understand what this assessment measures. So I am going to pose a question. If our teachers don't know what this assessment is about, and I'm not referring to the L teachers, I'm referring to all the teachers that our students have in front of them, right? The content area teachers as well. How can our students prepare meaningfully? This disconnect puts our learners at a disadvantage, one where their access to services is being determined by a test that they don't fully understand, so that, we can really think of it this way. They are essentially taking the test without preparation or guidance. So moreover, as we know, the NYSSLAT proficiency levels often determine the types of services, right, that our students receive. So it is critical that all educators are well informed to ensure that these decisions are fair, accurate, and supportive of students' ongoing development. Aqida had already mentioned the shortage of certified high-quality L teachers, but I do want to mention that certification alone doesn't equate to readiness, right? We must build systems where Ls aren't treated as a one-size-fits-all group and where we don't limit their access to advanced or specialized programs simply because of their English proficiency. Policy-wise, I would say I saw in the chat someone had mentioned funding. Yes, equitable funding is crucial, and schools with high concentrations of ELLs need additional support, not only for language services, but also for professional learning, social emotional supports, and culturally responsive curriculum. And so at the systems level, we do have to prioritize access. And for example, ensuring that ELLs are not excluded, again, like I've said, from specialized programs or screened schools due to language proficiency. With that being said, I do want to mention that high quality education, that kind of, when I read this question, that was bolded for me. High quality education for our ELLs is high quality education for all students. And what I mean by that is intentional and consistent co-planning between content teachers and ENL teachers must be non-negotiable. Schools must be required to provide dedicated time and space for this collaboration. And going forward, this expectation, I would hope, would be clearly embedded in policy. Most importantly, we must continue to shift the narrative. Our multilingual learners are not behind. They are linguistically talented, and their ability to navigate multiple languages is an asset, not a limitation. When we recognize and leverage that strength, we empower them to thrive, and in doing so, enrich the learning environment for all students. And so with that being said, again, translation materials, we want to ensure that they are actually valid, and we are hopeful that it will soon become valid for all languages, even the low incidence languages that we've mentioned, but particularly for bilingual programs. So no school should feel discouraged. What we often hear from our schools is, I would love to open this bilingual program for our students. However, there's no ready-made resources. So what, our teachers would have to plan everything. So instead, we must ensure that all schools have the tools they need to support the academic growth of their students.
Thank you so much. Pass it to Teresa.
Yeah, I think Aqida and Dr. Abedin has said so much that it's hard for me to add. Yeah, I just want to echo. I've heard a lot of ELL students talk about how they're pulled out for separate English class, for separate ESOL classes, and on the side, and they say that it kind of makes them feel like, kind of targeted in some sense. And, everyone knows that they're ELL students. And so kind of maybe integrating that into the classroom so they're not pulled out separately, or maybe there's other avenues around for that. And most importantly, I think including CBOs as part of the efforts. I think there are a lot of great CBOs around that really know the community, and I feel like they would be able to be great partners to the schools, be great advocates as well, and especially because a lot of the CBOs have speak the languages that the parents speak, and they understand their community. So I think if there's a way for CBOs to be more involved in New York City public schools, that would be great.
Thank you. And I'll pass it to Chair Joseph.
I second everything that was said. I second that across the board. But first, as my colleagues here on this call have said, we must, one, fully fund bilingual education and dual education across every borough. Too many neighborhoods. I know one of my colleagues keep calling, Chair Joseph, we need a bilingual program in Elmhurst, Queens. So I have to do that. And we don't have access to strong bilingual education, even though research shows that not only does the ELL student benefit, but the English proficient students also benefit from a high quality bilingual program. Two, we must ensure that ELL students have access to advanced coursework. Someone said that. Enrichment, like everyone else. AP placement classes too. Too often they tracked in remedial classes when we know they can do much better placed in those high level classes as well, which limits their long-term potential. So that's one thing I know for sure. Policy, which I will work on, should also more robust professional development between teachers, so they're equipped with tools to support multi-language teachers, and they must plan together. It should not be outside planning. I plan in my corner. It should be simultaneously. And sometimes when I was an ELL teacher, I never did a lot of pull out. I did a lot of push in to support the students while they're learning with their classmates, so they are not part of the isolation. When we talk about isolation, that also isolates students, take them away, and they have to play catch up when they get back into classrooms. So I love the push-in model, plan with the teachers, and the classroom teachers should also have the opportunity to leave the school to go to PDs for multi-language learners to find out how those students are also learning. What are the different UDLs, point of entry, that they can have with these students? Accountability. We must definitely, the city must commit to transparent reporting on our multi-language students, on graduation rates, college readiness, reclassification for those who were misplaced in the wrong classrooms. We can actually measure progress and close the gaps. They keep saying gaps. We find that a lot of our multi-language students do go on to do so well in taking AP classes, advanced classes, college readiness classes, a lot of the College Now programs. A lot of our ELL students are thriving. Maybe we also need to take a lot of that data from the NYCTEL and use that data to drive our policy, to drive our assessment, and also to drive how we teach those students that come to us the following year with that data. I'm big on data. Data used to drive my instruction. Data will always drive how I do policy. But if it's not there, I won't know. So I'm working on, I got ideas now.
Thank you so much. So the next question is related, and I'm gonna ask Councilmember Joseph and Dr. Abedin, particular in your positionalities, to kind of reflect on this question, which is, can you share practices or strategies currently being implemented in New York City or other regions to support ELL MLLs and MLLs?
I know in New York City, one of the models I look at is dual language, but they're not available everywhere. They're not evenly distributed. So where they do exist, they help students maintain their native language, and even other students learn a new language while gaining English proficiency, something that supports cognitive development and cultural pride. And we said that in celebrating our students in and out of schools, right? In and out of schools. Some schools use community school model, which I love. I love the community school model, where wraparound services like immigration services, healthcare. Our immigrant communities have so many barriers, and the school system should not be one of them. We should do everything we can in our power to remove those barriers. In after school enrichment, I remember I used to run a Saturday program for our multi-language students, and they used to love coming because they were the only ones in the building. They got all the attention they needed. It wasn't rushed. We used to make sure they went on trips, they left the building. And one of the things we used to do is also include the parents in taking those trips. And it was designated just for our ENL students. It was just for them. It was their little utopia. Allow them to leave the building, visit sites, bring their parents, and the children were teaching their parents, look at this, and they were able to explain a lot of the stuff. And I'm one of those people that believe in student voice. My students always had the voice to tell everything, to celebrate everything. Also, one of the things I wanted to see, other cities have also piloted family academies where students receive English classes, which is one thing I used to do at my school. So during the daytime, we used to support the families, and in the evening, the school was open 3 days a week. In the evening from 6 to 9 to support the parents to come and learn basic literacy, to come and learn English language, to come and learn computer skills, how to write a resume. If you wanted to get healthy, we also on Tuesday nights, we used to do Zumba classes. So the building became that beacon of hope for our community where they can come Monday through Friday. Monday through Thursday, the school was open till 9 p.m. every night, teaching our families how to use a computer. How to set up an email was such a big thing for our immigrant communities. Teaching them that, teaching them fire safety. We had fire safety, the little things we take for granted, we were teaching them all of that. So in my district, I supported schools and making sure we have bilingual counselors, social workers to help academically, and social emotional learning. And I've always said that it must be embedded in the curriculum. It cannot be a standalone. And even for our multi-language learners, that SEL curriculum must be embedded in their lessons as well.
So across New York City, we're seeing some powerful strategies take root. In the Bronx, we've implemented monthly professional learning workshops for our ELL educators, but not just for our teachers who service ELLs. These sessions also include a +1 model where administrators or co-teachers attend alongside so that learning and planning can happen together. I see on the chat that co-planning is so important for our ELLs, right? So that is a must. And if we truly believe all teachers are teachers of ELLs, then we must ensure that they all know how to support ELLs effectively. Secondly, we also are expanding bilingual programs that reflect our diversity across New York City, including Bengali, Arabic, and also the city's first Albanian transitional bilingual program. In fact, just last week, we celebrated the grand opening of the city's first transitional Albanian program, as I've just mentioned, with elected officials, and even the president of Albania was in attendance. So that's huge. That speaks volume. It was a powerful affirmation of the value of our students' languages and identities, and the community was there. We only have one teacher. We're starting off with kindergarten. We only have one Albanian teacher. However, if you walked into the school, you would think the entire school is an Albanian school. That's how powerful it was. Citywide, we're also boldly reimagining multilingual education by engaging students, families, and educators directly. We know that you must have lived experiences that not everyone experiences, right? And so their lived experiences are guiding our next steps. This year, we also launched a new English language development curriculum pilot to streamline uniformity and efforts that is aimed at helping teachers meet the needs of entering and emerging students' English language development with a connection to the core curriculum. So it's not happening in isolation, but we're ensuring that when these students go back to the integrated classroom, that they feel welcomed, affirmed, and are part of the Tier 1 instruction. So there is also citywide the Bilingual Education Teacher Leaders Initiative this year, where we are ensuring that experienced educators in bilingual programs who receive embedded professional development and leadership opportunities so that we can build capacity. This model not only supports current staff, but strengthens the pipeline for future bilingual leaders. Also, a big hope is that we want to give every child the opportunity to access the promise and potential of being a multilingual learner. So if a New York City public school student graduates with the seal of biliteracy, they now earn up to 8 credits at 11 CUNY colleges, saving them time and money. These efforts are all part of building a more coherent, intentional system that serves multilingual learners with both rigor and care.
Thank you so much for sharing some of the ongoing new policies and practices that are either being implemented or are being ideated upon. A related question also for Councilmember Joseph and Dr. Abedin is looking ahead, if there are any next steps or policy priorities that you want to point us to, right, for ensuring equitable educational outcomes for ELLs and MLLs. We'd love to hear from you.
Sure. I came with 4 bullet points. So my next step is expansion and equity, ensuring every borough, especially bilingual educators who are short in supply. We should provide incentives. Educators get certified in bilingual and ESL instruction. And I know one of the things that I know New York City Public Schools and the state and UFT worked on, if you decide to switch your license, you're losing your tenure. That was one of the something that a lot of educators was holding on to their license, because if I switch it out, I'm going to lose my tenure. So which is in the shortage area, which is really good. It's very encouraging. I also want to prioritize teacher recruitment, retention, especially in bilingual education. And also priority integration of also technology, language support tools, also very important in the classroom, so ELLs can learn content and language simultaneously. They should not be a standalone. Finally, we must see ELLs as integral part of New York City's future workforce as well. And civic life, that meaning holding ourselves accountable for ensure that they graduate, not just with English proficiency, but skills and confidence to succeed in college and career, and all the other little tweaks I will be looking at to make sure that we're implementing them and making sure they're funded. I don't like unfunded mandates. I don't like to say, oh, we should be doing this and there's no money to it. No, we want to make sure that we're fully funding our program. As our landscape has changed so much, we must adapt. I think we're way behind. I think there are other states. I think Colorado has gone past us. I think we could look at them as for some models as well. Colorado has done really well in training their educators and teaching their students. So there's some best practices that we can always look at as well, so we can better perfect our system to meet the moment and to meet the needs of our New York City students.
Thank you.
Chair Joseph. That was amazing. I can go ahead and answer this question as well. I also have 4 bullets. So I think, looking ahead, we must continue to invest in and diversify the multilingual educator pipeline. However, this investment must also go beyond classroom teachers. All stakeholders, including school and district leaders, must be equipped with the cultural understanding, empathy, and knowledge necessary to effectively support multilingual learners. Many of our students and families bring lived experiences, as I've mentioned before, that educators and leaders may not share. So this makes it essential for professional development focused on leveraging the strengths of our multilingual learners to begin at the leadership level. When leaders are fully informed and aligned with best practices for serving our multilingual learners, they create the conditions for teachers to implement that knowledge with confidence and support. Without this alignment, even the most well-trained teachers may feel constrained in their ability to meet students' needs. So what we're doing here in the Bronx is that I am having monthly meetings with superintendents where we talk about what our ELLs needs are, what professional development topics we may need to ensure that teachers receive, as well as what questions and/or concerns do our superintendents have in order for them to plan to meet the needs of our multilingual learners, right? So we plan together on a monthly basis with district leadership team, as well as their multilingual learner leads, so that we can not only meet our ELLs needs policy-wise, but also their academic needs. We are also advocating the ELL-centered accountability systems and assessments that align with both the NYSESLAT and the core curriculum. Currently, there is a lack of comprehensive progress monitoring tools that measure students' proficiency levels throughout the academic year. So we do have the NYSESLAT, but then when we talk about monitoring tools to see how our students are doing in terms of English language development, we see that we need systems that go beyond a year-end English proficiency assessment to track those linguistic and academic growth continuously, enabling our schools to make timely data-informed decisions to better support our multilingual learners. And above all, we must reframe multilingualism as the superpower it is. Our citywide data confirms this. Our ELLs, students who were once identified as ELLs, are outperforming in state exams and graduation rates. That's not a coincidence, right? That's the result of resilience, brilliance, and system-level support. So with that being said, I end with multilingual learners don't need to be brought up to speed. They need to be given opportunities to lead, to access advanced coursework, and to be celebrated for who they are when all own that shared responsibility for their learning. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such thoughtful responses. And that is actually the end of our structured questions that we had planned, which gives us some time to go into Q&A from folks who are on call. So I'll open it up, and just to give folks a sense of time, we'll have Q&A for about 10 minutes, and then we'll go into closing, which includes next steps, which includes sharing information about the hearing that's happening tomorrow on oversight for supporting English language learners. So with that, I will open it up for Q&A from folks.
I've been monitoring the chat, which has been robust with conversation, folks who agree with our panelists and have added their own context and experiences. So I encourage our panelists to go and read the comments. But one of the questions asked by Ruth is, can you provide examples of successful implementation of the recommendations? Was there advocacy for funding, and what kind of recruitment for qualified staff? There are a lot of questions here. Support for parents who speak low incident languages. So I'm just going to recopy that question in the chat for our panelists to take a look. You don't have to answer all of them, whichever ones really jump out to you as important based on your experience.
Yes, there was advocacy for funding. I can answer the funding. Yes, there was advocacy for funding, also to create a workforce. Remember I said our ELLs are multi-language in our communities that can provide that, to create a workforce. I know when I spoke about Quechua, for example, we said that we should create a language bank using them and making sure we're training that language to make sure they can be employable. And support for parents. So they created, I know Councilmember Gutierrez created like a sort of like a task force to work with those parents that spoke the low incidence, and they would create their communities and bring that back, the messaging back and forth, because it was a unique population that spoke that language just in her district. So I know she created and met them where they are. And that's one of the other things. We must also meet multi-language learners where they are in how we provide support. So that was one of the supports that we worked with New York City Public Schools, was also involved in the briefing, and how do we create that synergy and that energy to make sure that we're bringing the messaging back to community as well, that they are supported. We don't have the language as written, but there's community support. And when we talked about community, they were part of the community to bring the messaging back and forth.
I will share that there's always advocacy for funding. It's always needed for our ELLs. But I am also a firm believer as the Bronx Mill L director. I say this to my team all the time. If we focus so much on what's not working, we lose track of what is working, right? And so my belief is always to work within what's, again, within our control, what's within our sphere of control. And so when to support these low incidence languages, when I was a teacher, a middle school teacher, I founded a transitional bilingual Bangla program for our Bengali students. And that program, while scary, started off with just myself and my husband, who was a social studies teacher. I was the ELA teacher. We started off with teaching two content areas, right? Because there was a lack of staff. But within 4 years, it turned into a full-blown program with all the content area teachers that we needed. Again, as we've mentioned before, resources are always limited, especially for our, for the Bangla language. So fundforteachers.org, I will go ahead and put it in the chat. That was an amazing organization. So what we've done as teachers is we went ahead on Google and searched up every single opportunity that there may exist for teachers to travel abroad to bring back some of these resources. And so we found Fund for Teachers, where they actually funded our trip to Bangladesh to get resources for this program. And so they gave us $5,000 per teacher, where we wrote a proposal. We said we wanted to observe English medium classrooms in Bangladesh and see the resources that these teachers are utilizing in these English medium schools. And we were able to utilize that funding that they gave us to ship back resources of Bangla materials to 127, which is a middle school in the Bronx. Those resources still live in the bookshelves of that school. So students are still benefiting from those resources. But I always say that when there are systematic barriers, as advocates for ELLs, we don't stay put, right? We constantly search for what we can do in order to meet their needs. And that was one of the ways that we ensured that not only our students felt supported, but also our parents who speak low incidence languages.
Thank you so much. It's such an incredible program to learn, and it's always inspiring to hear about innovative practices to tackle a lot of these complex issues. Just bumping in the chat in case anyone else has any other additional insight to offer to this question, because I know there were a few questions coupled in, but also seeing another question that was added, which was the funding and backing at the state level or just district level? And thank you, everyone, for your work and wisdom.
I've added an answer to that, that funding for education happens at the city and the state, or at least and its advocacy. Like, for example, as Councilmember Joseph talked about, city funding is for programs, and the state funding for foundation aid and increasing weight for our ELL students in the formula. But if the council member or Dr. Abedin want to add more, please.
In 2022, we convened a working group to change the formula for fair student funding in New York. So we also changed the formula. We added more weight for students in high needs and students in temporary housing. That has never been done before in order to kind of equal the playing field for our schools when we talk about equitable funding. So that's one work, and it's a group. It's a working group that remains active. Anytime we need to pull in, if we need to add or take away stuff that needs to be, if an L weight needs to be added, I'm just throwing out there. Maybe the group needs to reconvene and add that. But it was historic in itself to just change the formula that hasn't been touched in 20 years from the time that I was teaching, for us to change the formula to add more weight for our students in high need and temporary housing. So that's what the city did on its side, and happy that the state added a weight for ELL students as well.
Excellent, thank you. Are there any additional questions that folks in the audience have for our panelists? If not, thank you so much to our panelists for sharing insight. Everyone on this call is doing incredible work in advocating for ELL students and families, and doing a lot to ensure that our families and communities remain involved in the education system as best as possible. And as part of that, actually, this is a great segue into the closing ask of everyone here. One is, as shared throughout the presentation today, to please take a look at the case study that we're so excited to have officially launched and published today. It's live on our website, and you've seen the link in the chat a few times. The case study is an excellent way to kind of understand the lived experiences of many of the students and families in New York City and the different sort of situations that arise that various ELL families are interfacing with depending on their individual situation. And so, and in addition to documenting those lived experiences, the report also has an excellent list of recommendations, as well as some context around things that are already happening, to help inform those recommendations as well as the existing case studies. So that's the final plug to please take a look at the case study, to not only read it and engage with it, but also if there are recommendations on there that you all are working on, if there are recommendations that folks here are interested in taking on, to work on, that we would love to partner. We would love to know more about what you're doing there. And so I am certainly a resource to reach out to, and folks at CACF. And we would love to continue that conversation. And the second ask of folks, if there are things that you heard in the conversation today that are maybe questions in your mind of the ways that ELL students and families are receiving resources or may not currently be receiving resources. And if there's something you want to advocate for on that regard, there is a hearing tomorrow, an oversight hearing that is particularly talking about the ways that English language learners are receiving resources necessary for them to thrive in the classroom. And as we all learned today, that is a right that ELL students are entitled to receive all of the resources necessary to thrive in the classroom. And so as such, there is a hearing tomorrow, and I will share email information in a follow-up email. But if you're interested in testifying, we can send the link. Thank you, Felicia, who sent in the link that you can sign up to testify. And my email is available if anyone needs help or support in drafting that testimony, or just if it's your first time navigating testimony, I'm happy to be that resource. But thank you, everyone, for joining, and thank you to our panelists for contributing to the conversation and adding such wonderful insight.